The unseen custodian. In the annals of espionage, heroes are often imagined as charismatic, daring figures, skilled in the arts of deception and combat. Rose Valland was none of these things. Archival photographs from the late 1930s show a woman who seemed to cultivate invisibility. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her clothes were modest and functional, and her gaze, often directed slightly away from the camera, was one of intense, private contemplation. Born in 1898 to a blacksmith in the small town of Saint-Étienne-de-Saint-Gilloise, she was a woman of humble origins who had ascended through sheer intellect and dedication. She had studied art history at the École du Louvre and the Sorbonne, eventually becoming a volunteer attaché at the Jeu de Paume Museum in 1932. She was not a chief curator, but a quiet, diligent academic, an expert in the Renaissance, a figure who blended into the museum's background like a piece of well-worn furniture. This perceived insignificance would become her greatest weapon. Colleagues described her as intensely private, meticulous to a fault, and possessing a near-photographic memory, traits that seemed suited for academia, not for war. Her personal diaries from the period, though sparse, speak not of ambition, but of a deep, almost spiritual connection to the art she oversaw. To her, a painting was not a commodity, it was the living embodiment of human history, culture, and genius. It was a piece of a nation's identity. As the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe in 1939, Valland, along with her superior, Jacques Jaujard, director of the French National Museums, participated in the clandestine evacuation of the Louvre's public collections to the safety of chateaux in the French countryside. It was a monumental logistical feat, a preemptive strike to save France's public heritage. But no one, not even the resourceful Jaujard, could have anticipated the rapacious and systematic nature of the plunder that was to come, a plunder that would target not public treasures, but the private soul of its citizens. Rose Valland remained in Paris, a quiet sentinel in a city holding its breath, the guardian of a now empty museum. She believed her work was done. In reality, it was only just beginning. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The Jackals in the Garden. The fall of France in June 1940 was a wound cut deep into the national psyche. The jackboot heels of the Wehrmacht echoed on the Champs-Élysées, and with them came a different kind of army. On the 30th of June, 1940, Hitler issued a directive authorizing the confiscation of all valuable art in the occupied territories, particularly that belonging to Jews. To execute this, he empowered the ideologue Alfred Rosenberg and his specialized task force, the ERR. By October 1940, the ERR, under the command of the pompous Baron Kurt von Baer, had requisitioned the Jeu de Paume. The choice of venue was cruelly symbolic. A public gallery of modern art was to become a private warehouse for stolen history. Archival footage from the era, shot by the Germans themselves, shows the museum's transformation. The airy galleries, once home to impressionist masterpieces, were now crammed with a chaotic jumble of treasures. Gilded furniture was piled high, priceless tapestries were rolled and stacked like cordwood, and crates filled with paintings by Degas, Renoir, and Picasso lined the walls. The ERR operated with chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. They were not common looters smashing and grabbing, they were art historians, librarians, and photographers, applying their professional skills to an act of mass theft. They meticulously photographed and catalogued each item, assigning it an inventory number before it was packed for shipment to Germany. In this environment of organized violation, Rose Valland made a request. Understanding that the Nazis needed someone with knowledge of the building and its systems, she approached Baron von Baer and asked to remain, officially to look after the building. She played the part of the meek, cooperative French civil servant perfectly. The Germans, steeped in their ideology of male and Aryan supremacy, looked at this plain, middle-aged woman who spoke no German and saw no threat. They granted her request, dismissing her as part of the scenery. Her official title became voluntary guardian, a role that allowed her to be present, to watch, and, most importantly, to listen. They had just locked the mouse in the cheese pantry, never suspecting she was a lion in disguise. The ideology of theft. To understand Rose Valland's mission, one must first analyze the dual-pronged strategy of Nazi plunder. It was driven by two distinct but intertwined motivations: the grandiose ideological vision of Adolf Hitler and the voracious personal greed of his second-in-command, Hermann Göring. Hitler, a failed artist himself, envisioned creating the world's greatest art museum, the Führermuseum, in his hometown of Linz, Austria. This museum would be the cultural crown jewel of the Thousand-Year Reich, filled with the finest masterpieces of European history, art that, in his view, rightfully belonged to the Germanic people. The ERR's primary function was to acquire this art. Their records, captured after the war, are a testament to this mission. They detail the systematic seizure of major Jewish-owned collections, such as those belonging to the Rothschild, Kahn, and Schloss families. This was not just theft, it was cultural annihilation. By seizing the art, they were erasing the legacy and cultural contributions of Jewish people from European history. Then there was Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. While Hitler's interest was institutional, Göring's was pathologically personal. A man of extravagant tastes and boundless avarice, Göring used the ERR as his personal shopping service. He made no fewer than 20 visits to the Jeu de Paume to survey the loot. Valland, in her later memoirs, described these visits with contemptuous precision. Göring would stride through the galleries, his corpulent figure draped in ostentatious uniforms or, bizarrely, white silk robes, pointing with a baton at the treasures he desired for his own estate, Carenhall. He favored old masters, tapestries, and anything that conveyed power and wealth. His selections took precedence over even the Führermuseum project. The logistical apparatus behind this was staggering. Art handlers, restorers, and packers worked tirelessly. The technology was simple but effective: custom-built wooden crates, meticulously labeled with codes that Valland would soon begin to memorize. The entire operation was a microcosm of the Nazi state, a veneer of bureaucratic order and legality masking an enterprise of profound criminality, driven by a bizarre mix of pseudo-academic ideology and primitive greed. Rose Valland was now the sole, secret witness to it all. A vow of silence and ink. The moment of transformation from passive observer to active spy is not recorded in a single, dramatic diary entry. It was a gradual, hardening resolve. Her initial agreement to stay was likely one of professional duty, a curator's instinct to protect the building. But as she witnessed the daily parade of stolen beauty and the casual cruelty of the ERR officers, something shifted. She saw priceless family heirlooms, religious artifacts, and cherished portraits, the very fabric of people's lives, being tagged and crated like merchandise. She heard the Germans laughing about the Jewish families who had been dispossessed, many of whom were already on their way to concentration camps. It was her close, secret collaboration with Jacques Jaujard that solidified her new role. Jaujard, a man with deep connections to the French resistance, recognized the unique opportunity. He could not be present himself, as he was too high profile. But Rose, the quiet, overlooked Mademoiselle Valland, was the perfect insider. In clandestine meetings, he implored her to stay, to watch, and to remember everything. It was a pact that placed her in unimaginable peril. She was surrounded by heavily armed SS and Wehrmacht guards. The ERR officers, though educated, were fanatical Nazis. Discovery did not mean mere dismissal, it meant interrogation by the Gestapo at their dreaded headquarters on the Rue des Filles du Calvaire, torture, and almost certain execution as a spy. The psychological pressure was immense. She had to maintain a dual identity: by day, the slightly dim-witted, cooperative French functionary, and by night, a meticulous intelligence agent. The human factor was her greatest risk and her greatest asset. She cultivated her persona, feigning ignorance of German, a language she had secretly studied and understood perfectly. This allowed her to stand in rooms where sensitive conversations were taking place, dismissed as a deaf and dumb piece of the furniture. The Germans would discuss train schedules, destinations, and the contents of crates right in front of her. Her vow was one of silence to her enemies and of ink to posterity. She would become the memory of France's stolen heritage. The Secret Ledger. Rose Valland's Espionage was a masterpiece of low-tech intelligence gathering. She had no hidden cameras, no microtransmitters, no tools of the trade glorified in fiction. Her only weapons were her memory, her nerve, and the contents of the ERR's wastebaskets. Her methodology, pieced together from her post-war testimony and recovered documents, was painstakingly methodical. During the day, she would move through the museum, ostensibly sweeping floors or checking on the building's maintenance. All the while, she was absorbing information with every sense. She memorized the faces of the Nazi officials and their collaborators. She eavesdropped on conversations, picking up key logistical details. She noted the codes painted on the sides of the crates, codes that corresponded to the collections from which the art was stolen, e.g., R4 Rothschild. Most ingeniously, she realized that the German clerks, in their bureaucratic haste, were careless with their trash. Every evening, after the officers had left for their lavish Parisian apartments and parties, Rose would carefully sift through the discarded papers in the bins. Here she found her gold, crumpled notes, shipping manifests, and, most valuably, used sheets of carbon paper. Holding these up to the light, she could read faint impressions of the official documents, revealing exactly which pieces of art were in which crate and, crucially, their ultimate destination. After leaving the museum each night, she would cycle through the darkened streets of occupied Paris to her small apartment on the Rue de Navarre. There, by the dim light of a single bulb, she would meticulously transcribe every detail she had gathered that day into a series of small notebooks. She created a secret ledger, cross-referencing crate numbers with artworks, transportation details, and the German castles and salt mines being used as repositories. There were thousands of entries. Crate number 3, Vermeer's The Astronomer, destination Kogel Castle. Crate number 12, a collection of 18th century silver, destination Neuschwanstein Castle. Train car number, departure date, track number at the Gare d'Austerlitz. No detail was too small. For 4 years, she lived this dangerous double life, her small apartment becoming a secret archive, a counterledger to the ERR's books of plunder, an invaluable resource that, if it survived the war, held the key to the greatest treasure hunt in history. The Göring spectacle and the art of invisibility. Archival memoranda from the ERR headquarters revealed the internal power struggle that Rose Valland deftly exploited. While Alfred Rosenberg's organization was officially in charge, Hermann Göring treated the Jeu de Paume as his personal department store, and his visits were carefully choreographed events of state-level importance. Valland's own post-war accounts, penned with surgical precision, provide a chilling biographical analysis of the Reichsmarschall. He was not just a thief, he was a connoisseur of the highest order, and his greed was matched only by his vanity. When Göring was expected, a nervous energy would grip the museum. The finest stolen pieces would be artfully displayed, as if for a gallery opening. Valland, feigning her usual duties, would observe the spectacle. She noted how Göring, often arriving in a cavalcade of Mercedes staff cars, would ignore the ERR's senior officers and deal directly with his personal art advisor, Walter Andreas Hofer. Together, they would sweep through the rooms. On one documented visit in late 1942, Göring laid claim to one of the most significant pieces to pass through the museum, Vermeer's The Astronomer, seized from the Edouard de Rothschild collection. Valland watched as he stood before the masterpiece, his face flushed with possessive desire. The moment was thick with the stench of corrupt power. While his entourage hung on his every word, Valland, the invisible woman in the corner with a dust cloth, was committing the scene to memory. She listened as they discussed shipping the Vermeer not to the Führermuseum in Linz, but directly to Göring's personal train, destined for his sprawling estate, Hall. That evening, in her ledger, she did not simply write Vermeer, the astronomer. She noted the date, Göring's presence, the name Hofer, and the ultimate destination, Hall. She understood a critical tactical detail: the loot was being divided. This wasn't a single, monolithic operation. It was a fractured enterprise driven by competing egos. Knowing who took what and where they sent it was not just an inventory, it was a map of the enemy's internal fractures, a map that would be indispensable for the hunt to come. The ghosts in the crates. The crime being perpetrated at the Jeu de Paume was not victimless, a fact Rose Valland confronted daily. While the Germans saw collections, inventory numbers, and assets, Valland saw the ghosts of the dispossessed. The human factor, so absent from the ERR's bureaucratic ledgers, was ever present for her. On one occasion, a shipment arrived from a seized apartment in the 16th arrondissement. Among the grand furniture and paintings was a crate that had been improperly sealed. Inside, mixed with silver candelabras and fine china, was a child's suitcase. Valland, ensuring she was unobserved, opened it. The contents were not valuable in any monetary sense, but they were priceless. There was a worn teddy bear, a book of fairy tales with a handwritten inscription on the flyleaf, "To my dearest Leah, on her 6th birthday, Papa," and a stack of family photographs tied with a ribbon. In her secret writings, Valland described this moment as a physical blow. The black and white photos showed a smiling family on a beach, celebrating a birthday, a young girl holding the very same teddy bear. These were not the faceless enemies of the Reich described in Nazi propaganda. They were a family, their lives, memories, and very identity packed away and stolen along with their possessions. This discovery solidified the profound moral dimension of her work. She was not merely tracking property. She was bearing witness for the vanished. The economic context of this plunder was total annihilation. Families were stripped of all wealth, their assets liquidated to fund the German war machine, their homes turned over to collaborators or German officials. Valland began to see her secret ledger as more than an intelligence document, it was a memorial. Each entry, a painting, a sculpture, a piece of furniture, was a placeholder for a life that had been torn apart. Her mission was now twofold: to recover the art and, in doing so, to preserve the last tangible link to the people the Nazis were trying to erase from history. The train to Neuschwanstein. By 1943, the logistics of the ERR operation had reached a terrifying scale of efficiency, a direct reflection of the German war economy's ability to co-opt and repurpose the infrastructure of occupied nations. The French National Railway, the SNCF, became an unwilling accomplice, its trains and tracks now serving as the arteries of the looting machine. Rose Valland's most vital intelligence concerned these shipments. From her vantage point, she tracked the entire logistical chain. She saw the custom crates, built from French timber, being loaded onto Wehrmacht trucks. She overheard the dispatch orders for the Gare d'Austerlitz, the primary terminal for shipments heading to Germany. More than once, risking everything, she cycled to the rail yard to discreetly observe the loading process. A train designated for the ERR was a formidable sight. Dozens of sealed boxcars, under heavy SS guard, would be waiting on a designated track. One particular shipment in the winter of 1944, catalogued as Train 40044, was among the largest. It contained hundreds of crates filled with masterpieces destined for one of the main repositories, the fairy tale castle of Neuschwanstein in Bavaria. Valland, having acquired the train's manifest from a discarded carbon sheet, knew its contents intimately. It carried 148 crates containing works by Boucher, Fragonard, and Chardin, the entire David Weil collection. Watching these cultural treasures being loaded onto trains that, on other days, carried French citizens to forced labor camps or Jewish families to Auschwitz, was a source of profound anguish. But her analytical mind processed it as critical data. She noted the train's number, the specific track, the departure time, and the stated destination. The Nazi strategy was to disperse the art across dozens of secure locations, remote castles, fortified monasteries, and deep salt mines, to protect it from the increasing threat of Allied bombing raids. This dispersal was also designed to make post-war recovery nearly impossible. They were hiding history in 1,000 places. But thanks to Rose Valland's secret ledger, the treasure map was being drawn in real time. A whisper of German. The constant strain of her double life brought Rose Valland to the edge of discovery on several occasions. The human factor in espionage is a double-edged sword. Her unassuming persona was her shield, but a single slip could be fatal. One freezing afternoon in January 1944, the new de facto head of the ERR in France, the suave and intelligent Dr. Bruno Losey, was overseeing the packing of a collection of Impressionist paintings. Losey, unlike the blustering Baron von Baer, was sharp and observant. He noticed Valland lingering near a desk where shipping orders were being discussed. For months, he had seen this quiet woman moving silently through the galleries, always present but never intrusive. A flicker of suspicion crossed his mind. He approached her directly. In perfect, rapid-fire German, he asked her a complex question about the museum's heating system, a deliberate test of her long-held pretense of not understanding the language. The moment, as she would later recount, was one of pure, cold terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Years of work, the fate of thousands of treasures, and her own life hung on her reaction. She met his gaze with a carefully crafted look of polite bewilderment. She did not react to the German words. Instead, she waited a beat, as if trying to understand his tone, then responded in slow, simple French, "Pardon, monsieur, je ne comprends pas, I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand." She gestured vaguely towards the radiators, feigning a dim-witted attempt to grasp his meaning. Losi stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. He saw only the blank, patient face of the spinster curator she pretended to be. With a slight shrug of dismissal, he turned away and continued his conversation. Valland felt a wave of relief so intense it almost buckled her knees. She had passed the test. Her shield held. The incident, however, served as a stark reminder of the razor's edge she walked. The Germans were not all fools, and as the war began to turn against them, their paranoia and ruthlessness would only grow. The frantic exodus. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, sent a seismic shockwave through occupied Paris. For Rose Valland, the sound of distant artillery practice had been a constant for weeks, but the news of D-Day, whispered excitedly and secretly among Parisians, changed the entire atmosphere at the Jeu de Paume. The cool, arrogant confidence of the ERR officers evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of panic and urgency. The war's strategic reality had finally breached the walls of their stolen kingdom. The meticulous, pseudo-academic process of cataloging devolved into a frantic scramble. The primary mission was no longer about curating for the Führermuseum, it was about getting everything of value out of France before the Allies arrived. The pace of shipments accelerated dramatically. Trucks arrived and departed at all hours. Valland's work became a desperate race against time. She had less time to observe, less opportunity to sift through trash, as the Germans began burning more of their documents. Her risk factor escalated exponentially. Armed guards were more numerous, their tempers frayed. The final, desperate phase of the plunder was underway. Baron von Baer and his staff began packing their own bags, shipping personal crates filled with looted luxuries back to their estates in Germany. It was a free-for-all. Amid this chaos, Valland overheard the most terrifying conversation of her 4-year vigil. A group of SS officers were discussing contingency plans for the final evacuation. One officer spoke of a directive: if the assets could not be successfully transported to the Reich, they were to be destroyed. Dynamite. Fire. Anything to prevent the art from falling back into Allied hands. The ultimate expression of the Nazi ideology: if we cannot have it, no one will. Rose Valland's mission had now reached its terrifying endgame. It was no longer enough to be a passive recorder of history. She now had to find a way to intervene and save the art from total annihilation. The last train from Paris. In the first week of August 1944, with the sounds of the approaching Allied front growing from a distant rumble to a percussive reality, Rose Valland documented the final, desperate act of the ERR. It was to be their magnum opus of theft, one last train, packed to the brim with the remaining modern art that Hitler had deemed degenerate but which Göring and others still coveted for its trade value. This included priceless works by Picasso, Dali, and Miro, art that represented the very soul of modernism the Nazis so despised. The train, numbered 40044 just like the one months earlier but with a new, urgent manifest, was being loaded under extreme duress at the Aubervilliers freight depot on the northern outskirts of Paris. Valland, through her now honed intelligence network, which included discreet railway workers and resistance contacts provided by Jacques Jaujard, knew the train's departure was imminent. Her secret ledger contained its manifest, 148 crates filled with an astonishing collection of modern masterpieces. This was the moment her role had to shift from passive archivist to active saboteur. Armed with the train's number, its track assignment, and its destination, likely a depot near Nikolsburg, Germany, she passed the intelligence to Jaujard. The information was a tactical bombshell. Jaujard, using his authority and influence, immediately contacted the French resistance. The message was simple and urgent: this train must not leave France. The biography of the ordinary men and women of the resistance during these final days of occupation is one of incredible bravery. These were not trained soldiers, but railway workers, mechanics, and clerks who were risking immediate execution. Armed with Valland's precise intelligence, a plan was put into motion. The objective was not to destroy the train; that would destroy the art. The objective was to delay it, to obstruct it, to create a mechanical failure so convincing that it would keep the train paralyzed on French soil until the Allies arrived. The fate of the last great cache of stolen art rested on a whispered message from an unassuming curator and the courage of ordinary railwaymen. A bureaucratic war of attrition. The plan to halt train 40044 was a masterpiece of tactical ingenuity, fought not with bullets, but with paperwork and wrenches. The resistance cell at the Aubervilliers depot, acting on Valland's information, sprang into action. They could not launch a frontal assault against the heavily armed German guards. Instead, they waged a war of bureaucratic sabotage. First, the train's locomotive mysteriously developed a faulty boiler. The German officer in charge, furious at the delay, ordered a replacement engine. The resistance railwaymen dutifully complied, but produced an engine that was too large for the depot's turntable. More hours were lost. Next, essential paperwork for the train's departure went missing, leading to a frantic search through the stationmaster's office. It was found hours later, misfiled under the wrong heading. Each delay was meticulously designed to seem like a plausible, infuriating example of French incompetence rather than deliberate sabotage. Rose Valland, back at the Jeu de Paume, waited in an agony of suspense. She had no direct communication with the resistance cell. Her part was done; she had provided the intelligence. Now she could only watch the increasingly agitated Germans make frantic phone calls. The train, which was supposed to leave on August 15th, was still sitting in the depot on the 16th. Finally, the Germans managed to get the train moving. But the resistance had a final, brilliant trick. As the train moved slowly out of the yard, saboteurs managed to disconnect the brake lines on several of the rear cars. The resulting mechanical failure brought the train shuddering to a halt a few miles outside the city, near the town of Aulnay-sous-Bois. The German guards were stranded, the train was disabled, and General Patton's Third Army was now less than 30 miles from Paris. The race was won. The train, with its priceless cargo, would be liberated along with the city. This episode is a perfect analysis of asymmetrical warfare, a small group with superior intelligence and local knowledge completely outmaneuvering a larger, more powerful force through clever, non-violent tactics. Liberation and a new mission. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Archival footage captures the ecstatic crowds pouring onto the streets, the tricolor flag once again flying from the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. For Rose Valland, the celebration was short-lived. As French and American soldiers secured the city, she made her way to the Jeu de Paume. The building was deserted. The ERR officers had fled in the final hours, leaving behind a chaotic scene of empty rooms, scattered papers, and the ghosts of 4 years of occupation. Her war was not over; a new one was beginning. Her first priority was to secure her secret records. She retrieved the notebooks from her apartment, their pages filled with the meticulous script that held the key to the entire Nazi looting operation. Within days, she presented herself to the new French authorities. At first, they didn't know what to make of this quiet woman claiming to hold such explosive information. But as she began to detail the scope of the ERR's activities, naming specific German officers, listing stolen paintings, and, most importantly, identifying the secret storage locations, Neuschwanstein Castle, the Kagel Monastery, the Alta Sea salt mine, their skepticism turned to awe. The economic and cultural value of her intelligence was incalculable. It represented billions of dollars in modern currency, but more than that, it was the blueprint for restoring a continent's plundered heritage. In November 1944, her status was formalized. Captain Rose Valland, of the French First Army. She was given a uniform, a rank, and a mission to go to Germany and lead the hunt. The shy, invisible curator was now an army officer, tasked with confronting the very men she had spied on and forcing them to reveal their secrets. Confronting the architect of plunder. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled into ruins, Captain Rose Valland arrived in a devastated Germany. Her transformation was complete. The mousy curator was now an officer vested with the full authority of the victorious Allied powers. Her primary objective was to track down the senior leadership of the ERR and use her knowledge to force their cooperation. Her ultimate target was Dr. Bruno Losey, the intelligent, cunning art historian who had nearly exposed her back in Paris. Losey had been captured by American forces and was being held for interrogation. Valland arranged to confront him. The scene, as she later described it, was thick with irony. She was brought into an interrogation room where Losey sat, now a prisoner, his bespoke suit replaced by drab prison clothes. He did not recognize her at first. To him, she was just another French officer. Valland began her questioning in crisp, perfect German. Losey's eyes widened in shock. He recognized the language, but couldn't place the face. She let the silence hang in the air before saying, "Do you remember the little curator at the Jeu de Paume? The one who looked after the building?" The psychological impact was devastating. Losey, the man who held himself in such high intellectual and racial esteem, realized he had been outwitted for 4 years by the very woman he had dismissed as a dim-witted subhuman. His arrogance shattered. Valland proceeded to lay out her evidence. She recited from memory the dates of his visits, the paintings he had personally selected for Göring, the specific train manifests for shipments he had overseen. Losey was cornered. Facing the prospect of a war crimes trial and a long prison sentence, he began to talk. He provided Valland with detailed information about the dispersal of the collections, confirming locations she already knew and revealing new ones. He was the first of many former ERR officials whom Valland would turn, using her encyclopedic knowledge as the ultimate interrogation tool. The salt mine of Audacious. Of all the secret repositories Rose Valland had documented, none was more important or more perilous than the salt mine at Audacious, a small village nestled in the Austrian Alps. The logistical decision to use salt mines as storage was strategically sound. The constant low temperature and humidity were ideal for preserving artwork, and the deep subterranean tunnels offered perfect protection from Allied bombs. Beginning in 1943, the Nazis had moved the most prized treasures of the Führermuseum collection into this labyrinthine mine. This included Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, Vermeer's The Art of Painting, and the Ghent altarpiece by the Van Eyck brothers. Valland's ledger contained multiple entries referencing AC or LZ for Lind's collection, all pointing to this location. As Allied forces closed in, the local Nazi Gauleiter, the fanatical August Eigruber, issued a direct order from Hitler, codenamed Führer Directive Nero. If the Reich was to fall, its cultural treasures were to be dynamited, denying them to the enemy. 8 massive, 500-kilogram aerial bombs were moved into the mine, wired, and ready for detonation. The fate of Western civilization's greatest artistic achievements hung by a thread. The human factors at play in this final, desperate standoff were extraordinary. The mine's director, Dr. Emmerich Pochmuller, and its chief engineer, Otto Hobler, were caught between their duty to obey orders and their horror at the thought of destroying such irreplaceable art. They began a campaign of passive resistance, citing technical difficulties with the detonation wiring. Simultaneously, a local resistance group, aware of the mine's contents and the Nazi plan, prepared to storm the mine to disarm the bombs. Into this incredibly tense situation, information derived from Valland's intelligence was fed to the advancing American forces. The Monuments men of the U.S. Third Army were alerted to the extreme urgency of securing the Audacious mine. The race was on to capture the mine before the fanatical Gauleiter could enforce his catastrophic order. The Monuments Men and the Lady from Paris. The Story of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives (MFAA) program is a unique chapter in military history. Comprised of approximately 345 men and women from 13 nations, these were museum directors, curators, art historians, and archivists who were given military commissions and sent to the front lines. Their mission: to mitigate damage to cultural sites and, following the cessation of hostilities, to track, recover, and restitute looted works of art. When the first Monuments Men arrived in a newly liberated Paris, they were tasked with the impossible, finding an estimated 5 million stolen cultural objects with almost no leads. Their initial efforts were frustrated, a search for needles in a continent-sized haystack. It was then that they were directed to Jacques Jaujard, who in turn introduced them to the unassuming Captain Rose Valland. The first meeting, as described in the diaries of Monuments Man James Roemer, later director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was a revelation. Valland, still in her simple civilian clothes before being commissioned, appeared cautious and reserved. She listened patiently as the eager Americans explained their mission. Then, she unlocked a cabinet and produced her secret notebooks. Roemer and his colleagues were stunned. They had been searching for a map, and here was the mapmaker. Valland's ledger was the Rosetta Stone of Nazi plunder. It provided the tactical intelligence they desperately needed. Her data was immediately put to use, guiding MFAA teams directly to key collection points. Instead of searching Bavaria blindly, they could go straight to Neuschwanstein Castle. Instead of combing through Austria, they could focus on the Kabul Monastery and the Alta Sea salt mine. The synergy between Valland's meticulous, 4-year intelligence-gathering operation and the logistical and military might of the MFAA was immediate and profound. She was quickly co-opted into their operations, her quiet authority and encyclopedic knowledge earning her the deep respect of the American officers. She was no longer a lone operative, she was the strategic heart of the largest treasure hunt in history. The triumphant return. The recovery process was a monumental logistical undertaking. As MFAA teams, guided by Valland's information, secured the repositories, they discovered scenes that beggared belief. At Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle was stuffed to the rafters with stolen furniture, paintings, and jewelry, the personal loot of the Nazi hierarchy. In the Alta Sea salt mine, after the bombs were successfully disarmed by the quick action of the miners and the swift arrival of the U.S. Army, they found over 6,500 paintings, including masterpieces thought lost forever. Each recovered item had to be carefully removed, catalogued at newly established central collecting points, the largest being in Munich, and prepared for restitution. Rose Valland played a crucial role in this phase. She traveled to the collecting points, her small frame a familiar sight amidst uniformed soldiers and stacks of priceless art. She could walk through a warehouse containing thousands of items and, with her near-photographic memory, identify the origin of a specific painting or tapestry. This, she would say, pointing to a Fragonard, is from the David Weil collection, packed in crate 47 of train 40044. Her knowledge was invaluable in untangling the chaotic mess of ownership. In 1946, the first repatriation trains began their journey back to Paris. These were moments of profound national symbolism. As the crates were unloaded at the Jeu de Paume, the very site of the crime, a sense of poetic justice filled the air. Newsreel cameras captured the scenes as works like Vermeer's The Astronomer were carefully uncrated and inspected. For France, it was not just the return of paintings, it was the restoration of a piece of its soul, a visible sign that the cultural destruction of the Nazi regime had failed. At the center of it all, typically avoiding the cameras, was Rose Valland. For her, each returned piece was a promise kept to the ghosts she had seen in the crates. The frustration of restitution. Victory and recovery did not signal the end of Rose Valland's struggle. In many ways, the post-war period presented a new, more insidious type of battle. The physical recovery of the art was one thing, its legal restitution was another. The human cost of the Holocaust and the war had created a bureaucratic nightmare. The original owners of much of the art were dead, murdered in the camps, leaving no heirs. Entire family lines had been extinguished. The French government, eager to replenish its national collections, was sometimes slow to search for distant relatives, absorbing many ownerless works into the Musées Nationaux Recuperation, MNR. Valland, driven by her profound moral compass, found this deeply troubling. She had not risked her life for 4 years to see stolen art end up in a different collection, even that of her own country. She became a fierce and often lonely advocate for aggressive and thorough restitution. She fought tirelessly within the French bureaucracy, pushing the Commission de Récupération Artistique to exhaust every possible avenue to find the rightful owners or their legal heirs. Her biographical files from this period are filled with letters, memos, and petitions, arguing passionately that the state had a moral obligation to the victims. This often put her at odds with her superiors and former colleagues, who now saw her as a stubborn obstacle to the efficient processing of the recovered art. The economic context had also shifted. A painting by a master was an immense national asset, and the temptation to keep it was strong. Valland's integrity was immovable. She saw each piece not as an asset, but as the final possession of a murdered family, and she fought for decades to see that justice was done, often with frustratingly limited success. This was her final, quiet war, fought in archives and government offices. A legacy in the shadows. Rose Valland never sought the spotlight. After her heroic service, she continued her career as an art curator, eventually receiving the title of Conservateur des Musées Nationaux in 1953. To the public, she was just another civil servant. The French government, perhaps embarrassed by the extent of collaboration and its own sometimes sluggish restitution efforts, was slow to officially recognize the full scope of her heroism. While the monument's men were celebrated in America, Valland's story remained largely unknown, buried in classified military archives and the esoteric world of art restitution. It was only in her later years, and primarily after the publication of her memoir Le Front de l'Art in 1961, that a wider appreciation began to form. She received the Legion of Honor and the Resistance Medal from France, the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit from West Germany, and the Medal of Freedom from the United States. Yet, she remained an intensely private person, rarely speaking of her wartime experiences. She feared, correctly, that her story would be romanticized or sensationalized, distracting from what she saw as the central issue, the victims and the art itself. She lived a modest life in the same small apartment from which she had run her one-woman intelligence operation. When she passed away in 1980, she was buried in her hometown of Saint-Étienne-de-Saint-Gilloise, her grave marked by a simple stone. Her legacy is not one of grand monuments, but of quiet, profound impact. It is found in the galleries of the Louvre and museums across the world, where masterpieces hang for the public to see, saved from destruction by her courage. It is found in the archives of art restitution, where her meticulous notes still serve as the primary source for provenance research. She proved that one person, armed with intellect, integrity, and immense bravery, could stand against an empire and save the soul of a continent. The Unfinished Archive. The comprehensive analysis of Rose Valland's story reveals a crucial truth: the work is not over. Of the more than 60,000 works of art returned to France after the war, approximately 2,000 remain unclaimed in the MNR collections, their ownership still a mystery. These orphaned artworks are a direct legacy of the Holocaust's efficiency in erasing family lines. Today, a new generation of art historians and provenance researchers, using advanced digital archives and forensic techniques, continue the work that Valland started. Her secret ledgers remain a foundational resource, the starting point for tracing the path of a painting from a family's pre-war Parisian salon, through the ERR's inventory at the Jeu de Paume, to a salt mine in Austria, a collecting point in Munich, and finally to the storage depot of a French museum. Each successful restitution to a newly discovered heir is a direct continuation of her mission. The story of Rose Valland is not a closed historical file, it is an active, ongoing process. It serves as a permanent, cautionary tale about the fragility of culture and the ideology of destruction. It reminds us that war is not only fought over territory, but also over memory, identity, and art. The quiet, unassuming woman who haunted the galleries of the Jeu de Paume became its most important guardian, leaving behind not just a legacy of recovered treasures, but an enduring moral and archival imperative to never stop searching for the truth and to restore what was stolen, no matter how long it takes. The ghost in the gallery still watches.